Before I start, if this story speaks to your heart, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your city or country and what time it is where you are watching from right now, because I want to know how far this story is reaching across the world. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old, and what I'm about to tell you didn't just break my family, it erased everything I thought I knew about it. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why one message sent 15 years later shattered my father in a way no one saw coming. But it all started on a night I will never forget. You don't get to speak. Not after what you did. Those were the first words my sister Ashley ever said to me, while my father stood right behind her, already deciding I was guilty without even looking me in the eye. I remember blinking at her, confused, standing in the hallway with my backpack still on my shoulder and saying, "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." Ashley didn't even hesitate. She turned to my father, her voice shaking like she was the one being hurt. Not me. "Dad, I swear she took it. My money was gone after she was in my room." And just like that, my stomach dropped because I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was planned. My father, David Carter, finally looked at me, but not like a father looks at his daughter. It was colder. Final. "Emily, go pack your things." I stepped forward instantly. "No, wait, this isn't true. I didn't take anything from her. She's lying." Ashley gasped loudly like I had just proven her point. "See? She always does this. She always lies when she gets caught." My father raised his hand slightly, stopping me before I could even finish. "Enough. I don't want excuses. Just go." My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. "You're not even going to ask me what happened? You're just going to believe her?" He looked away for a second, like he didn't want to deal with me anymore. I said go. That was it. No questions, no second chance, no hesitation. I turned slowly, still waiting for someone to stop me, for someone to say this was wrong. But behind me, I heard Ashley's voice again, softer this time, almost satisfied. "I told you she'd do this." And then I understood something that changed everything. I wasn't being punished for what I did. I was being removed for what I represented. The daughter no one truly listened to. The daughter who didn't fit the story they already decided to believe. I walked upstairs in silence. Every step felt heavier than the last. My room looked the same, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. I packed slowly, not because I needed time, but because I kept expecting someone to come in and stop this. My hands shook as I folded clothes into a small bag. From downstairs, I could hear them talking. Ashley crying again. My father comforting her. My name wasn't mentioned once. Not even once. When I came back down, the front door was already open, like they had prepared for this moment before I even walked in. My father stood near the hallway, arms crossed, not looking at me. Ashley was behind him, wiping her eyes, watching everything like she had already won. I stopped at the door and said quietly, "So this is it? You're just throwing me out?" My father finally looked at me again. "You made your choice." My voice broke a little. "No, you made it for me." No answer, just silence. That silence was louder than anything else in my life. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me, and no one followed. No one called my name. No one asked me to come back. I stood there on the sidewalk, 16 years old, holding a bag that suddenly felt like everything I had left in the world, realizing something I didn't have words for yet, that I had just been erased from my own family. And what I didn't know then was that the truth behind that moment was never about the stolen money at all, but something far more deliberate, something my sister made sure I would never be allowed to explain. The truth is, I did not become the daughter they accused me of overnight. I became it slowly, long before that night ever happened. When I think back to my childhood, there was never a moment where I was actually chosen first. It always started with Ashley. She had this way of filling a room before she even spoke, like she belonged everywhere she stood. And I learned early that I had to make myself smaller just to exist beside her. I remember one Christmas when I was maybe 9 years old, standing in the living room, watching her open a brand new tablet while I unwrapped a set of used books from my father's office. Ashley jumped up and hugged him immediately. "Thank you, Dad, this is perfect." I remember looking at my gift and asking quietly, "Did you forget I wanted a sketch pad?" My father didn't even look up. "You can use paper from the kitchen drawer, Emily. Don't make a big deal out of everything. That sentence followed me for years. Don't make a big deal out of everything. Because in our house, Ashley's needs were never a big deal, but mine always were. At school events, my father always arrived early for Ashley's performances, sitting in the front row with his phone ready, taking pictures like she was the center of everything. When it was my turn for anything, I remember him checking his watch more than once, whispering to my mother, "How long is this going to take?" Even when I got an award in middle school for a science project, I remember running off the stage looking for him in the crowd, only to hear him say later that night, "Ashley's choir rehearsal was more important, Emily. You understand that, right?" I did not understand it. Not then. At home, the differences were even smaller but sharper. Ashley got new clothes every season. I got hand-me-downs folded neatly in my drawer with tags cut off so I would not notice. She had her own bathroom. I shared mine with guests. She got birthday parties with friends from school. I got dinner at home with a cake from the grocery store. Once, when I was 12, I asked my father directly, "Why does Ashley always get more than me?" He didn't even pause. "Because she needs it more. You are strong enough to handle less." Strong enough to handle less. I did not know then that it was not a compliment. It was a warning. Over time, I learned my place without being told. I learned not to ask for attention twice. I learned to wait outside rooms instead of entering them. I learned that if Ashley cried, I was already wrong, even if I had done nothing. One night, I remember sitting in the kitchen doing homework, while Ashley argued loudly in the living room about something trivial. My father walked past me, placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "It is okay, sweetheart, I will fix it." Then he looked at me and added, "Keep your voice down, Emily." I was not even speaking, but somehow I was already the problem. The pattern was so normal in our house that I stopped questioning it. I started believing that maybe I really was just harder to love, that maybe being overlooked was just my role in the family. But there were moments I still remember clearly, moments that should have told me the truth earlier, like the time Ashley broke my favorite necklace and said I did it myself. My father looked at the broken pieces on the floor and said, "Careless mistakes happen." Or the time I stayed up all night helping him prepare documents for work because he was stressed, only to hear him thank Ashley the next morning for being such a good support to the family. She had been asleep the entire night. I think what hurt most was not the favoritism itself, but how easily it was accepted, like it was natural, like I was the one disrupting the balance simply by existing differently. There was one afternoon, maybe 2 years before everything collapsed, when I tried to talk to my father alone. I waited until Ashley left the house and said quietly, "Do you ever feel like you treat me differently?" He barely looked up from his newspaper. "Emily, what is this about now?" "I just feel like I am always last." He finally sighed, folded the paper and said, "You are not last. You are just independent. Ashley needs more guidance. That is all." Then he stood up and ended the conversation like it was something unnecessary. That was the moment I should have understood everything. But I didn't. I still believed that family meant truth eventually mattered. That night I walked back to my room and stared at the ceiling, thinking maybe I just had to try harder to be seen. I did not realize I was already being written out of the story long before I was ever accused of anything. And somewhere in all of that quiet imbalance, something else was building beneath the surface. Something I would not understand until the moment my entire life was taken away from me without a single question asked. It took me years to understand that silence can build something louder than any argument ever could. After I left that house, I stopped expecting fairness, and I stopped waiting for anyone to choose me. Life in the beginning was not beautiful. It was survival. I worked wherever I could, sometimes 2 jobs at once, sometimes sleeping only a few hours, just to make rent on a small apartment that smelled like old paint and cheap coffee. But something strange happened in that silence. I started noticing patterns in people, in systems, in decisions that most people ignored. I learned how to solve problems others walked away from. I learned how to rebuild things that were already considered broken. I did not know it at the time, but I was building something of my own without even calling it that yet. One evening, while working late at a small consulting firm, I was asked to review a failing client account. Everyone else had given up on it. The manager sighed and said, "If you can even make a dent in this, I will be impressed." I remember sitting there, reading through the files, and thinking this is just another system that people stopped trying to understand. 3 days later, I presented a solution that saved them nearly $180,000 in projected losses. The room went quiet after I finished speaking. Then my manager leaned back and said, "Where exactly did you learn to do this?" I did not have a dramatic answer. I simply said, "I had to learn how to see what others miss." That was the first time I felt seen in a different way, not as a daughter, not as a mistake, but as someone who could actually build value. A few months later, I was offered a position on a larger project team. It was not glamorous, but it was real responsibility, real pressure, real expectations. I accepted without hesitation. That was the first time I felt like my life was moving forward instead of just surviving backward. But even as my world slowly expanded, I never told anyone from my past. I did not reach back. I did not reconnect. I built distance like it was protection. Then one afternoon, everything shifted again. I received an unexpected message from a recruiter representing a private advisory group. They had reviewed my work across multiple projects and wanted me to consult on higher-level restructuring cases. I remember staring at the email for a long time before responding. It felt unreal that something I had built quietly in the background was finally being recognized. When I arrived at the first meeting, I was not prepared for how quickly everything would escalate. The room was full of executives, people who had spent decades in positions I had only read about. One of them looked at me and said, "You are younger than we expected." Another added with a slight smile, "We were told you solve problems others avoid." I simply nodded and said, "Only if the data is complete." Within 2 weeks, I was assigned to lead a restructuring analysis that had been stalled for months. No one expected me to move fast. No one expected results. But I did not work for expectations anymore. I worked for outcomes. When I delivered the final report, the lead partner reviewed it in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Then he looked up and said, "This changes everything for the client." That was the moment my name started circulating in rooms I had never entered before. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, like a signal passing through systems I could not yet see. I should have felt victorious, but instead I felt something else. A strange awareness that success always comes with attention, and attention always brings exposure. And exposure, in my life, had never meant safety. It meant vulnerability. Around that same time, I began receiving occasional emails that I did not immediately recognize. No names, just references to my past that made my stomach tighten slightly every time I read them. I ignored them at first, but they kept coming. Short, vague, almost like someone testing whether I would respond. One line stood out more than the rest. "Some truths do not stay buried forever." I closed my laptop after reading it, sitting in silence longer than I should have. Because for the first time in many years, I felt something shift beneath everything I had built. Not fear exactly, but recognition that the life I had carefully constructed might not remain separate from the one I left behind. And somewhere, without me knowing it yet, the past was already beginning to move toward me again. The first time I realized something was wrong again, it was not because someone told me directly. It was because silence changed in a way I had learned to recognize. The emails had stopped for almost 2 weeks, and instead of relief, I felt a kind of pressure building behind it, like a storm holding itself too still. I was in a conference room reviewing a restructuring plan when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No greeting, no name, just a single line. "You should see what your father is saying about you now." I stared at it for a few seconds longer than I should have, then locked my phone and continued the meeting. But I could not unsee it. That evening, curiosity won over discipline. I opened it. It was a screenshot. A family group message I was never part of, but my name was there. My father, David Carter, had written, "Emily has been struggling for years. We did everything we could, but she chose to leave and cut us off. Sometimes children become strangers to their own family." My hands went cold. There was more. Ashley had replied immediately underneath. "We tried to help her, Dad. She was always difficult. You did the right thing." And then another message from someone I barely recognized from old family circles. "It is sad, but not surprising. Some people just change." I sat there staring at the screen, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not anger yet, something worse. Recognition that a story had been written about me without my voice ever being included. The next day, it spread further than I expected. A former neighbor reached out during a client call break and said casually, "I heard about what happened with your family. I am sorry you went through that." I asked, "What do you mean?" There was a pause on the other end. "That situation with your sister and your father, It must have been hard. My stomach tightened. Who told you that? She hesitated. It was posted in a community thread. I think your sister mentioned it. I ended the call immediately. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from realization. The version of events I had never spoken about was now being spoken for me. And it was not true. That afternoon I received another message from Ashley herself. I hope you are not upset. I only told the truth when people asked. Dad deserves to know why you left the way you did. I read it 3 times, each word carefully chosen, polished, intentional, not emotional, strategic. I finally responded, "That is not what happened." Her reply came almost instantly. "That is how it looks from here." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, because it did not matter what I knew, it mattered what they believed. 2 days later, everything escalated. My father called me for the first time in 15 years. I almost did not answer, but something in me made me pick up. "Emily," his voice said, slower than I remembered, heavier. "We need to talk about what is being said." I stayed quiet. "Your sister is very upset," he continued. "People are asking questions about the past, about what really happened." I finally spoke. "And what did you tell them?" There was a pause. "What I believed at the time." That answer hit harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel, but because it was certain. I said quietly, "You never asked me." Another pause. "We did what we thought was right." That was when I understood the depth of it. The story was not just told, it was accepted. It had become truth in their world. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at nothing. Every version of me they had created was now circulating without resistance. The daughter who lied. The daughter who left. The daughter who could not be trusted. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it spread, like something alive. Then came the final message that changed everything. It was from Ashley again, but this time different. "You should stop pretending you were innocent. If you keep pushing this, you will only hurt Dad more." There it was, not fear, control. I did not respond. I simply opened a folder on my computer that I had never thought I would use. Inside were files I had kept for years without ever naming their purpose. Documents, records, emails, proof that the story they were telling was not just wrong, but constructed. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a long time, because once I pressed send, nothing would stay the same again. And at that exact moment, before I could decide what to do, my phone lit up again with an incoming call from my father. The call from my father came at a moment I was not emotionally prepared for, even though I thought I was. His name flashed on the screen, and for a few seconds I just stared at it, listening to the silence of my own apartment, realizing how easily the past can walk back into your life without permission. I finally answered, "Emily." His voice came through, slower than I remembered, almost careful, like he was stepping into unfamiliar ground. "We need to talk about what is going around." I did not respond immediately. I waited. "People are asking questions," he continued, "about your sister, about what really happened." I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, "What did you tell them?" There was a pause, a long one. "I told them what I believed at the time," he said. That sentence should have meant uncertainty, but it did not. It sounded final. I replied, "You never asked me what I believed." Another pause, shorter this time. "Emily, your sister was very upset back then. You were both young. Things get misunderstood." I closed my eyes for a moment. Misunderstood. That word felt too small for what had happened to me. "So now you think I am lying," I said calmly. "That is not what I said," he answered quickly, but he did not correct it either. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time without moving. I expected relief after finally speaking to him, but there was none. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, like something had been removed and nothing had replaced it. Later that evening, I received an email from Ashley. No greeting, no warmth, just a subject line that read, "Please stop this." The message inside was short. "You are making Dad relive something painful. I know you want attention, but this is hurting the family more than you realize." I read it twice, then a third time. It was not apology. It was control disguised as concern. I did not reply. Instead, I opened another message from my father that arrived minutes later. "Emily, I am asking you as your father. Please do not escalate this further. People are already talking." I stared at the words "your father" for a long time, because that was the part that hurt the most. Not what he was asking, but what he still believed he had the right to ask. Over the next few days, the messages increased. A voicemail from my aunt. "We just want peace in the family. Maybe it is better to let the past stay in the past." A text from a distant cousin I had not spoken to in over a decade. "I heard what happened. I hope you are okay, but maybe you should consider how this affects everyone else." Each message carried the same shape. Not curiosity, not truth-seeking, just pressure to remain silent so the story could stay unchanged. Then came the letter. A physical envelope arrived at my office. No return address, but I already knew who it was from before I opened it. My father's handwriting. I sat at my desk for a long time, before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a single page. "Emily, I do not understand why you are reopening something that we have all tried to move past. Your sister has suffered enough from this, and so have I. I am asking you to stop. We cannot undo what happened, but we can avoid making it worse." There was no question. No request for clarification. Only a request for silence. I placed the letter back on my desk and realized something I had not fully accepted before. They were not trying to understand me. They were trying to preserve a version of reality where I remained the reason everything had been difficult. That evening, I finally responded. Not with emotion, not with accusation, just with a single attachment. A folder containing documents I had kept for years. Emails, records. A timeline of events no one had ever bothered to reconstruct properly. I did not write a long explanation. I did not defend myself. I only wrote one line. "If you still believe your version is correct, read everything before you reply." Then I hit send. After that, everything went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not resolution. Something heavier. My phone stopped ringing. No messages. No emails. Even the pressure I had been feeling for days suddenly disappeared, replaced by something unfamiliar. Absence. I checked my inbox repeatedly, expecting a response that never came. Hours passed, then a day, then another. Nothing. It was as if my message had entered a place where words no longer traveled back. I sat alone in my apartment that night, looking at the dark window reflecting my own face, realizing that I was no longer part of any conversation on the other side. I had become a silence they were all choosing not to enter, and in that silence, I understood something I had not understood before. Being unheard is painful, but being intentionally ignored is something else entirely, something colder. And that was when I realized they were not done with me yet. They were just deciding how to respond. The silence after I sent the files was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that feels like something is being decided without you in the room. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, expecting a response from my father, from Ashley, from anyone. Nothing came. Not a single message. No read receipt, no acknowledgement. It was as if the entire family had collectively agreed that I no longer existed in their timeline. On the third day, I finally received a voicemail. My father's voice sounded heavier than before, slower, like every word had been measured and weighed before being spoken. "Emily, I received what you sent. I do not understand why you are doing this. If this is about closure, we can talk privately. But you are hurting your sister and reopening wounds that should stay closed." I stood in my kitchen listening to it twice. There was no mention of the documents, no denial, no correction. Just discomfort that I had disrupted something they had already settled internally. Later that evening, I called him back. He answered on the second ring. "Did you read it?" I asked. A pause. "Yes." I waited. And? Another pause. Longer this time. "I do not know what you want me to say, Emily." That was when I realized something I had been avoiding accepting. He was not processing truth. He was defending a version of reality that allowed him to remain comfortable. "I want you to read everything," I said quietly. "All of it." His voice tightened slightly. "I have seen enough to know that this is being interpreted in a way that is not fair to your sister." I closed my eyes. Not fair to her. Not a single question about whether it was fair to me. I said, "So you are not denying what is in the documents." Silence again. Then, "I am saying context matters." After that, I ended the call. I did not argue. There was no point anymore. That night, I sat alone for a long time, staring at my phone as if it might change if I waited long enough. It did not. The absence of response had become its own message. A few days later, I learned something else through a mutual contact. Ashley had started telling people I was unstable, that I was fixated on rewriting the past. The phrase was repeated exactly that way. I heard it from someone I used to know in college. "Emily, I do not know what happened, but Ashley said you are not doing well and that this is becoming an issue for your father." I remember asking, "An issue in what way?" There was hesitation on the other end. "She said you are contacting people with false claims." I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. False claims. That word followed me for the rest of the week like a shadow I could not step out of. I stopped trying to correct it publicly. I stopped responding to messages. I watched my inbox fill, and then slowly stop again, as if people were deciding which version of me to believe, based on which one required less discomfort. One evening, I received another voicemail, this time from Ashley. Her tone was different, controlled, almost rehearsed. "Emily, I do not know what you think you are doing, but you are making things worse for everyone. Dad is not well. If you care at all, you will stop this." I listened to it twice, not because I was confused, but because I was trying to understand how easily concern had been turned into pressure. I did not reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and stared at the same folder I had sent before. The documents were still there, unchanged, still factual, still ignored. I realized then that the problem was not whether I had proof. The problem was whether anyone was willing to see it without rejecting it first. That realization hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant the outcome was not about truth. It was about acceptance. And I was not being accepted into their version of reality anymore. That night, I walked outside for the first time in hours. The air was cold, quiet, and unfamiliar in a way I had not noticed before. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, realizing that I had reached a point I could not reverse. I was no longer waiting for them to understand me. I was only waiting to decide what I would do with the fact that they never would. And somewhere in that silence, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that I was no longer only reacting anymore. I was beginning to move forward. After everything went silent, I stopped waiting for them to return to me and started building a life that did not require their permission to exist. The first thing I did was move to a different part of the city, a small apartment with large windows that let in too much morning light and no memories attached to the walls. I changed my routine completely, waking up earlier, staying later at work, and focusing on projects that most people avoided because they were too complicated or too unstable. At my consulting firm, I was assigned to a failing restructuring case that had already gone through 3 analysts. My manager leaned back in his chair and said, "If you can stabilize this in under a month, I will personally recommend you for senior advisory." I remember nodding and replying, "Then give me access to everything, not just summaries." He looked surprised, then handed me the full file. That was the beginning of something that started quietly but grew faster than I expected. I spent nights studying data patterns, financial behavior, operational gaps, things most people skipped over because they were too time-consuming. One evening, a senior partner walked into the room while I was still working past midnight and said, "You are still here?" I replied without looking up, "The problem is not solved yet." He sat down beside me and said after a moment, "Most people would have given up by now." I finally looked at him and said, "Most people were never responsible for fixing it." That case turned around within 3 weeks. The client avoided a projected loss of over $200,000, and my name started circulating in internal meetings I was not invited to but somehow kept appearing in. I did not celebrate. I simply moved to the next assignment. There was no family to call, no approval to seek, no voice from my past to update. Only work, only progress, only structure I could control. One afternoon, after a long meeting, a colleague named Daniel approached me in the hallway. "I heard you are being considered for lead advisory on the Westbridge portfolio," he said. I adjusted my folder and replied, "Nothing has been confirmed." He smiled slightly. "They do not usually consider someone this early unless there is confidence behind the scenes." I did not respond, but I noticed how differently people looked at me now. Not with curiosity, but with expectation. Even then, I kept my distance. I did not share personal history. I did not explain where I came from. I only spoke when necessary. But what I did not know was that small traces of my work were beginning to spread beyond internal circles. Reports, summaries, and recommendations started moving upward into higher levels of review. One evening, My manager called me into his office and said, "We are putting your name forward for a private advisory panel." I asked, "Why me?" He replied simply, "Because you do not stop when others do." That night, I sat alone in my apartment looking at the city lights through the window, realizing that my life had become something structured, stable, and entirely separate from everything I had left behind. There were no more messages from my father, no more emails from Ashley, only silence that stretched further than before, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt distant, like another world I had stopped participating in. A few days later, I received an invitation to join a confidential restructuring consortium that worked with high-level clients across multiple states. The email was formal, brief, and ended with a line that stayed in my mind longer than expected. "Your analytical consistency has been noted across multiple independent reviews." I read it twice before closing my laptop. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was rebuilding from loss. I felt like I was building towards something that had no connection to what came before. And even though I did not say it out loud, I knew something was approaching, something larger than career, something that would eventually force the past and the present into the same room again. But at that moment, all I could see was forward movement, quiet progress, and a future that finally felt like it belonged only to me. The invitation to the advisory consortium changed the rhythm of my life in ways I did not immediately notice at first. It was not dramatic. There was no celebration, no announcement, no moment of recognition that felt like a movie scene. Instead, it was a quiet shift in how people spoke to me, how they waited for my input, how they positioned themselves in meetings when I entered the room. The first time I walked into the consortium headquarters, I remember noticing the silence before anything else. Not an empty silence, but a focused one, like everyone in the room already knew why I was there. A coordinator handed me a badge at reception. It had my full name printed clearly, Emily Carter. Beneath it, a single line that read, "Senior Advisory Consultant." I stared at it for a second longer than I intended, then clipped it onto my blazer without saying anything. The fabric felt heavier with it on, not physically, but in meaning. During the orientation meeting, a senior director glanced at my profile and said, "You are younger than we expected for this level of responsibility." I responded calmly, "Experience is not always measured by time." He paused, then nodded once and said, "Fair enough." That was the first time I realized I no longer had to explain myself to be taken seriously. Over the next few weeks, I was assigned to a multi-state restructuring portfolio involving high-value operational recovery cases. My role was not symbolic. I was reviewing financial frameworks, identifying structural inefficiencies, and advising on corrective strategies that affected millions of dollars in projected outcomes. In one meeting, a senior partner asked me directly, "Do you usually approach risk modeling this aggressively?" I looked at the projection board and replied, "I do not consider it aggressive. I consider it accurate." The room went quiet for a moment before he said, "That is exactly why you are here." Slowly, I began to notice how my name appeared in internal reports, not in passing but repeatedly, referenced in decision summaries and strategic recommendations. One afternoon, I walked into a conference room and found my proposed restructuring model already displayed on the main screen. A colleague leaned toward me and said, "The board approved your framework with minor adjustments." I nodded, then took my seat. There was no surprise anymore. Only confirmation that my work was being trusted at levels I had never been allowed near before. Even my presence began to shift how conversations unfolded. I no longer had to fight to be heard. I only had to speak once. One evening, after a long session reviewing a failing logistics network, a senior advisor named Michael looked at me and said, "You are very precise, almost detached." I answered without hesitation. Detachment allows clarity. Clarity allows solutions. He studied me for a moment and said quietly, "Most people lose one to gain the other." I did not respond because I understood what he meant, but I also understood why I could not afford that trade. Outside of work, my life remained simple, structured, quiet. I lived alone, I ate alone, and I planned my days without interruption. There were no calls from my past, no messages, no attempts to reopen what had been closed. The absence had become familiar enough that it no longer felt like loss. It felt like distance I had chosen. One morning, while preparing for a consortium briefing, I adjusted my blazer and noticed the reflection in the glass window. The woman looking back was not the same person who once stood outside a closed door at 16. The difference was not just in appearance, but in posture, in certainty, in the absence of hesitation in her eyes. When I arrived at the briefing, my title was displayed on the agenda screen: Lead Advisory Consultant, Strategic Recovery Division. As I stepped to the front of the room, a coordinator introduced me briefly. "This is Emily Carter. She will be leading today's analysis review." I did not correct him. I did not elaborate. I simply began speaking. Every decision I made that day was met with immediate acknowledgement, not because I demanded it, but because the results spoke first. When the session ended, a senior executive shook my hand and said, "We want you permanently on this division." I replied, "Understood." There was no need for further discussion. That evening, I left the building and walked through the city streets alone, the same city that once felt like survival and now felt like structure. My phone remained silent in my pocket. No messages, no interruptions, only time moving forward. And as I crossed the intersection near my apartment, I realized something quietly but clearly. The life I had built was no longer separate from me. It was stable, recognized, and expanding beyond what I had once imagined possible. But even as I stepped into that new reality, I could feel something distant beginning to shift again, as if the past had not disappeared at all. It had only been waiting for the right moment to reappear. The invitation arrived without warning, but I should have expected it. A short email marked urgent from the consortium office requesting my presence at a closed executive review session in Chicago. No explanation, no agenda details beyond a single line. Final review of historical advisory conflict case requiring consultant presence. I stared at the screen for a long moment before closing my laptop. Something about the wording felt heavier than usual, like the past had finally found an official entry point back into my life. The flight was early morning, cold air pressing against the airport windows as I waited at the gate, watching people move with the kind of normal urgency I no longer felt connected to. When I boarded, I noticed my hands were steady, not because I was calm, but because I had stopped expecting emotional preparation to matter anymore. The conference building in Chicago was larger than I remembered from previous visits, all glass and steel reflecting the gray sky. Inside, the atmosphere was different than before, less discussion, more waiting. As I walked through the security checkpoint, the receptionist glanced at my badge and said, "You are early for the session." I replied, "I prefer to observe before speaking." She nodded politely and directed me toward the upper floor. The meeting room was already partially filled when I entered. Senior advisors, legal consultants, and review board members were seated in quiet clusters, speaking in low tones. At the far end of the room, a large screen displayed case documentation, but the file name was blurred intentionally. I took my assigned seat near the center. A man across from me leaned slightly toward another and said, "Is that her? I thought she would be older." The other replied, "She is the one who rebuilt the Westbridge model." I did not react. I simply placed my folder on the table. A few minutes later, the lead coordinator stepped forward and said, "Before we begin, we need to clarify that this session is related to a historical advisory discrepancy involving a family-documented financial misrepresentation case." My attention sharpened slightly, though I still did not move. He continued, "This matter was escalated due to conflicting reports submitted over a decade ago." At that moment, I noticed a shift in the room, not loud, not obvious, but present. People were looking at me differently, as if my presence had suddenly been assigned, meaning beyond my role. Then the coordinator added, "We have also invited the original reporting party for clarification." I turned slightly toward the entrance door without thinking. It opened slowly, and that was when I saw him, my father, David Carter, older, slower, standing near the doorway as if unsure whether he was entering a room or returning to something he had avoided for years. His eyes scanned the room until they stopped on me. There was a pause that no one interrupted. Not a word was spoken. The air felt compressed, like the entire room had tightened around a single unresolved moment. He stepped forward slowly, then stopped again, his gaze fixed. I stood up automatically without realizing it. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw something I had not seen in years. Not authority, not certainty. Something closer to confusion trying to become understanding. The coordinator spoke again softly. "Mr. Carter, Please take your seat so we can begin the clarification process. But my father did not sit. Instead, he said quietly, I did not know she would be here. I replied in a calm voice. You were not expected to. The room shifted again, more attention now focused between us. A legal advisor opened a file and said, For record clarity, we will be reviewing the original incident documentation submitted by both parties. My father looked at the file, then back at me. Emily, he said carefully, as if testing the weight of my name in this space. I did not respond immediately. The screen behind them began to change slides, loading archived documents, scanned records, and timestamps from years ago. I felt the air tighten further, not from fear, but from recognition that something was about to be made visible that had never been properly examined before. My father finally said, There is something I need to say before this continues. The coordinator hesitated, then nodded. Every person in the room went still. I looked at the screen, then back at him, waiting. And just as he began to speak again, the first document appeared fully on the display, and everything in the room shifted at once. The moment the first document appeared on the screen, the entire room seemed to lose its sense of balance. It was not loud, not chaotic, just a quiet shift in attention as people began to read what was being displayed. My father stood near the front, still not sitting, his eyes fixed on the projection as if trying to understand why his past had suddenly become public record. The heading on the screen was simple, almost clinical, but it carried more weight than anything spoken in the room. Original Family Dispute Report and Supporting Financial Documentation. A legal advisor cleared his throat and said, For clarity, this document was submitted anonymously during the initial review period 15 years ago, but was never fully investigated due to conflicting statements. I felt the air in the room tighten slightly. My father finally spoke, his voice lower than before. This should not be here. The coordinator replied calmly. It is part of the official record. A second document loaded onto the screen, and I saw my own name appear in a format I had not seen in years, tied to statements I had never been allowed to correct at the time. My father turned slightly toward me, his expression no longer firm, but uncertain. Emily, he said slowly, why is this being shown now? I looked at him directly and answered in a steady voice. Because it was never shown when it should have been. Ashley shifted in her seat for the first time, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. This is unnecessary, she said quickly. This is old history. I turned toward her and said quietly, Old history is still history. The room did not react, but the silence changed. It became attentive instead of passive. Another document appeared, this time with timestamps, messages, and financial records. A senior analyst leaned forward and said, These entries suggest inconsistencies in the original claims. My father exhaled slowly, like he was trying to hold something together internally. This was never proven, he said. I replied, It was never properly reviewed. Ashley's voice rose slightly. Because there was nothing to review. You are twisting this. I did not raise my voice. I simply said, Then explain why your statement does not match the timestamps on these records. That question landed differently, not as accusation but as fact. Ashley hesitated for the first time. My father looked between the screen and me, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to realization he was not prepared for. You have been holding on to this, he said quietly. I answered, I did not hold on to anything. I documented what was never addressed. A consultant at the far end of the table spoke up carefully. For procedural accuracy, we need clarification on whether the original decision to remove the subject from the household was based on verified evidence or assumption. No one answered immediately. The room waited. My father finally spoke, but his voice was no longer confident. We believed we had enough information at the time. I nodded once. Belief is not the same as truth. Ashley looked at me directly now, her expression less controlled. You are doing this in front of everyone, she said. I replied softly. I did not bring this into the room. It was already here. The documents continued to scroll. Messages, records, gaps that had never been questioned before, each one adding weight without raising volume. My father took one step forward, then stopped again. For the first time, his voice lowered completely. Emily, what have you become? I looked at him without emotion and said, Someone you stopped recognizing a long time ago. The room remained silent, but the energy had changed completely. No one was speaking now. No one was interrupting. Even Ashley no longer looked certain. My father stared at the screen, then at me again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. And then, in a quieter voice than anything he had said before, he asked, "Is any of this reversible?" I did not answer immediately, because at that moment, the truth was no longer just being revealed. It was settling into a place that could not be undone. And the way he looked at me next made it clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The room did not move after the last document finished loading. It felt like everyone was waiting for the air itself to decide what to do next. My father was still standing, but his posture had changed completely. The confidence he walked in with was no longer there. It had been replaced by something quieter, something unsettled. Ashley was no longer speaking. She kept looking at the table, then at the screen, then back at me, as if trying to find a version of me that made more sense in her memory than the one standing in front of her. A senior legal consultant finally broke the silence. Based on the documentation presented, we are required to reassess the original decision framework. My father turned slightly toward him and said, "This is not necessary." But his voice lacked authority now. The consultant replied carefully, "With respect, it is necessary for compliance review." I stood still, watching all of it without interruption, not because I was detached, but because there was nothing left I needed to prove. My father finally looked at me again. "Emily," he said slowly, "what do you want from this?" I did not answer immediately. The question itself felt incomplete. After a moment, I said, "I did not come here for anything from you." That statement landed harder than anything I had said before. Ashley shifted in her chair and said, "So what is this then? Revenge?" I turned toward her and replied calmly, "If I wanted revenge, I would not have waited 15 years. That made her go silent again. The coordinator stepped forward slightly, trying to regain structure in the room. "We need to continue with formal clarification." But the atmosphere had already changed. My father sat down slowly for the first time, as if his body had finally accepted what his mind was still resisting. "We made decisions based on what we thought was true at the time," he said, almost to himself. I looked at him and responded, "You made decisions based on what was convenient to believe." He did not answer that. Instead, he looked at the table, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding on to something invisible. Ashley spoke again, but her voice was no longer controlled. "You are trying to destroy everything over something that happened when we were young." I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "I am correcting something that was never allowed to be questioned." A long pause followed. Then my father said quietly, "If we were wrong, why did you never come back?" I looked at him for a moment before answering, because there was nothing for me to return to that still recognized who I was. That answer left the room heavier than before. No one interrupted, no one corrected it. Ashley looked down, her hands now still. The legal advisor closed his folder slightly, as if unsure whether to continue. My father finally spoke again, but softer now. "We thought we were protecting the family." I replied, "You were protecting a version of the family that required me to disappear." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else that had been said that day. After that, no one spoke for a while. The meeting did not feel like a proceeding anymore. It felt like a collapse of certainty that no agenda could repair. Eventually, the coordinator cleared his throat and said, "We will need time to review the full scope of documentation before final conclusions are drawn." People began to shift in their seats, gathering papers, avoiding eye contact. My father remained seated, still not looking at me directly. Ashley stood slowly, her movements uncertain, and for the first time, she did not speak to anyone. As the room started to empty, my father finally looked up at me again. "Emily," he said quietly, "what happens now?" I paused for a moment, then replied, "Now you live with everything you chose not to see." I turned to leave after that, walking past them without urgency. No one stopped me. No one called my name again. But as I reached the doorway, I heard my father say one last thing, barely above a whisper. "I do not know how to fix this." I did not turn back. I kept walking, but the weight of those words stayed with me longer than I expected because for the first time, the truth had been accepted, but the damage it left behind was still unresolved. After the meeting, I did not go back to my old life. I did not return to any version of myself that still waited for permission to exist. I stayed in Chicago for 2 more days, not because I needed closure, but because I needed distance between who I was becoming and who they still believed I was. My hotel room was quiet, high above the city, where the lights at night looked like distant decisions being made without me. For the first time in a long time, I was not checking my phone for messages that would never come. There were no apologies, no explanations, only silence from a past that had finally been forced to face itself. On the 3rd morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the city move like nothing had ever happened in that conference room. My phone buzzed once. Unknown number. I did not answer. I already knew there was nothing left I needed to hear from them. When I returned home, my life resumed its structure, but something fundamental had shifted. At work, I was no longer just part of the advisory team. I had been formally promoted to lead strategic consultant for multi-region restructuring operations. My name appeared on internal documents with a level of authority I never would have been allowed to access years ago. In meetings, people no longer debated whether my analysis was correct. They asked how quickly it could be implemented. One afternoon, a junior consultant approached me after a briefing and said, "It is honestly intimidating how calm you are under pressure." I looked at him and replied, "Pressure does not feel the same when you are no longer trying to prove yourself to anyone." He nodded slowly, like he understood, even if he did not fully. But outside of work, the real change was quieter. I stopped measuring my days by whether I was seen or acknowledged. I started measuring them by whether I was stable, whether I was present, whether I was no longer carrying things I could not change. There were still moments, of course, when memory would return without warning. A sound, a phrase, a silence that felt too familiar. But instead of pulling me backward, those moments now passed through me and left me standing where I already was. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I paused at the building entrance and looked back at the glass reflection. I saw myself clearly. Not the daughter who was not believed, not the person erased from a family narrative, but someone who had learned how to exist without needing to be defended in order to be real. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken years to accept. Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is defined by who is willing to see you truthfully. And when that truth is denied for too long, walking away is not loss. It is survival. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening to this, it is this. Do not wait for people to confirm your worth before you believe it yourself. Do not shrink your voice to keep peace in places that require your silence to function. And do not ignore the quiet instinct inside you when something feels wrong, even if everyone else insists it is normal. There is a kind of peace that only arrives after you stop negotiating your value with people who benefit from you doubting it. And sometimes, that peace feels less like happiness at first, and more like finally breathing after holding your breath for years. If you are listening to this, and something in your life feels like it is asking you to disappear in order to be accepted, I want you to know you are not alone in that feeling. I am not speaking from perfection. I am speaking from experience. There were nights I thought I would never feel whole again. But healing is not a single moment. It is a series of choices to stop returning to what broke you. Thank you for staying with this story. Thank you for listening all the way through something that was never just about me, but about anyone who has ever been told their truth was too inconvenient to believe. If this resonated with you, take a moment to comment where you are watching from and share this with someone who might need it more than they say. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stay close because there are more voices waiting to be heard and more truths still unfolding in the next chapter of this journey. My name is Emily Carter. I am 31 years old, and the core truth I want to leave you with is this. Your value does not disappear just because someone refuses to see it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop asking to be understood by people who already chose not to understand you. There are more stories waiting for you here, more lives quietly unfolding in ways that will make you think, feel, and remember. And if you stay, you will see how deeply these truths run, and how many of them might already be closer to your own life than you realize.